Thank you, all of you, on behalf of SDPI for joining us. And many thanks to our collaborators, UNESCAP, particularly Dr. Hamza, Shobhajit, and the other team for collaborating with SDPI on the work that we will be discussing today. This is Dr. Sajid, your moderator plus a presenter of the work from Pakistan today. So let me begin by welcome remarks from Dr. Abid Suleri Saab. Dr. Abid Suleri was doing parallel sessions, so we will have a video recorded message that will be playing on the welcome remarks, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending from wherever you have logged in to be part of our annual conference. And today is the last day of the conference. So first of all, I'll take this opportunity to thanks all of you for turning this conference a huge success like always. And with this, I would also like to welcome and thanks my very distinguished panel today who have spared time and joined us today to discuss how one can have one can think of a resilient economy amidst pandemic. Thank you very much for being here and taking part in this discussion. Now the subject topic that we will be discussing in next hour and a half, we will be talking of how one can think of a resilient economy amidst a pandemic. Of course, when we were perceiving this panel, when we were conceptualizing this panel, we were thinking at what the government did during the first year of pandemic, what has it done during the second year of pandemic, and if God forbid Omicron, the new variant, if it goes out of hand, what is it that government needs to do, and what sort of lessons there are from which government can learn while making policies to turn our economy a resilient economy. SDPI at the very start of pandemic was approached by government of Pakistan to do some evidence based analysis on what needs to be done to minimize the damage to economy. We are thankful to UNESCAP for joining hands and supporting us in this endeavor, and we were able to actually recommend, give very solid recommendation to government of Pakistan, especially in the context of the fiscal stimulus package, in the context of small and medium entrepreneurs, SMEs, and how to protect them, and also we were able to recommend the food security dashboard and interventions in food security, which of course helped, and Prime Minister approved that food security dashboard, and it's now institutionalized at Ministry of National Food Security and Research. But one thing that came out of this whole exercise was need of data. Although data availability has improved a lot, we can see the data is there for many indicators, but one can argue that there is a room for improvement in that data, either the data collection, data uniformity, various indicators against which the data is collected. So the one thing that came recurring in all of our studies was importance of refined data on the basis of which policymakers they can formulate their policies. The second thing that came from SDPI research is about regional cooperation, and we realized that pandemic is the magnitude of disaster is huge, and no single country, no single government could actually take care of it. So we have to think of regional and regional plus collaborations and partnerships through which the economic resilience could be enhanced and could be improved. The third thing that came out of our studies and recommendation was need for documentation of economy. Yes, we know that the state bank stimulus perhaps it couldn't penetrate to the grassroots levels, especially to many of the small and medium entrepreneurs, simply because many of them they were not registered, or they were not doing their business in a documented regime, and that actually excluded them from any sort of fiscal stimulus or any sort of policy stimulus that government wanted to offer. And now is the time, learning from that, of course, not only that governments they have to do their efforts to maximize the documentation of economy, but the businesses, they also should come forward and get documented, so that God forbid, in case of any emergency, they can be reached, they can be approached, and they can be assisted. Of course, my team members, they would be sharing the complete findings and recommendations of their studies, and we have a keynote speaker, Dr. Shamshad, Akhtar, and other distinguished panelists who will make their remarks and contributions. I'd like to conclude on a note of thanks to the government authorities, to the UNESCAP, to the policymakers for understanding the importance of evidence for policy making, and this is a positive paradigm shift in public policy making arena. I hope with the refined data, with rigorous research, the new evidence would not only be captured, but also would provide us an opportunity to prepare solid recommendations, and I hope that public policy makers they would be willing to accept those recommendations and to implement us. I will also assure the government authorities, Planning Commission, and UNESCAP for our services for any future research studies that you would like us to conduct and give you a policy recommendation. Thank you.
Let me thank Dr. Abid Qayyum in his absentia for giving this message to us. And I really echo with all the thanks that Dr. Suleri has done. It was an excellent working multi-collaboration on the UNESCAP, on the side of the government. We had a very welcoming and opening kind of the open appetite for this evidence on how to recover resiliently. What can be the key intervention areas to bring the resilient economic recovery, which is inclusive, which is green, and which is sustainable and forward-looking. Let me now request today's chairperson, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, for her keynote. Over to you, ma'am, please.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to recognize Abid Suleri in his absence, and also other SDPI colleagues. You do deserve a special recognition because it's an incredible conference when I look at the agenda, and also your book is very comprehensive, Sustainable Development in Times of COVID-19. UNESCAP, of course, doesn't need an introduction to me. Hamza is an old colleague, and I think I'm not surprised that they have stepped up to the plate and developed an appropriate model, which will help us build capacities of our member states. So it's a welcome contribution, Hamza. I think no one anticipated the speed and the spread of transmission of this contagion. Spillover of pandemic and its systemic consequences are very serious. To some extent, I feel they have been masked in context of Pakistan by data that may not necessarily the most reliable one, as I see, because the magnitude is quite severe. If you walk through the corridors of really the poor communities, how stressful the situation is. Like other developing countries, Pakistan's state of preparedness for dealing with the pandemics, its transmission, its mitigation, and its risk management was almost non-existent, as I see. Health, being a provincial subject, faced acute resource constraints and shortages of supplies. Population and its density, low literacy levels, high self-employment, and social distress has aggravated the process of containment. Although we claim we have contained, the fact of matter is we haven't really been able to contain. No country has been able to contain it. Maybe the intensity may have been reduced. So notwithstanding Pakistan, the dynamics of the virus, I think Pakistan managed the COVID-19 fairly decently, despite the social and economic disruptions, which had to be instituted because we needed to contain the spread and the loss of life. It hurt, as we know, more the poor, and you all have the statistics, so I don't need to enumerate them. Pre-pandemic Pakistan's economic vulnerabilities that existed were compounded in fiscal year 2020, as is evident from the negative growth of the economy. Monetary stimulus was sizable, comprising low policy rate, easing of liquidity and regulatory framework, and extensive sector refinancing offered below policy rate to the tune of almost a couple of trillions or so. Fiscal stimulus was anchored on tax concessions for industries that didn't even deserve, frankly, and this housing package is pretty controversial, as I see. The expansion of the unconditional income transfer scheme was a welcome step and facilitated by the micropayment gateway system that Karandas, that I chair, has supported at the central bank. Economy, of course, rebounded from negative growth to various estimates being floated, almost 3.9% in fiscal year 2021. But as we know, when you have such a massive demand pressure at low policy rate, inflationary pressures build up. And it has been, of course, difficult because we have had to maintain loose monetary policy. We had rising global commodity market prices, and we have disruptions, real disruptions in food supplies that have been hurting poor. I'm not going to get into the agriculture and specific industry dynamics because some of you may already know. After sizable loss of output and rise in poverty and unemployment in the last 2 years, unemployment rate has gone up, and you find a lot of self-employed as we walk outside our corridors to be hanging around, not even having food to eat still. And there is, of course, glaring heightened risk from climate change that we face. So Pakistan needs to structure a sustainable, resilient, and green recovery, as is the topic of the day. It offers us an opportunity to build back better, but it requires stepping back from the business as usual and aligning recovery policies and programs to ensure that we are anchored on the sustainable growth path. It has to be backed, of course, by the implementation of SDGs. As we know, there are lots of these SDGs. So it has to be backed by implementation of at least the core SDGs. And it has to be well synchronized with a comprehensive climate action plan, which is very difficult to coordinate. So with the exception of course, few areas, pre-pandemic pace of SDGs implementation was slow and fragmented. And we knew that at the start of the SDGs launching. And this is true even of a lot of countries in Asia Pacific. Urgency of course, fast-tracking SDGs implementation is now more critical than ever before, because pandemic has reversed the gains in development. As we know, poverty is an example which has grown, but there has been a setback to health and education as farmer has overstretched. And schools were closed for a long time. And we think that digital education was working. Absolutely not for the poor people who do not have the digital facilities. So, sorry, I do have a bad throat, so you have to tolerate that. And we have gaps in some of the goals and indicators which grew as development projects were delayed or even postponed. Recovery cannot be resilient unless it is reinforced by macroeconomic stability, which is currently a bit jittery. And it has to focus, somehow we have to focus on doubling the investment GDP ratio to almost 30%. But this can only be realized if we have fiscal stability, which has to be well anchored through enhanced tax GDP ratio and reprioritization of public investment that leverages private finance, among others, through public-private partnership. Our external account deficit has to be put on a sustainable track, but that can only happen if we witness a doubling of the export earnings. And we all know that there has been substantial impetus to the exports offered by all the concessions, the tax concessions, and also to export-oriented industry that has benefited from various relaxed regulations, including refinancing that has been provided at below policy rate. There has to be adjustment in the domestic and external balance sheets to allow the state bank to ease the demand pressures and lower inflation, facilitating, of course, eventually the lowering of policy rate. So abstracting now a bit from intense twin deficit problem, Pakistan also faces other challenges. They are phenomenal. It needs to deal with the rising economic and social as well as climate vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned, we have to catch up with SDG gaps in the last 8 years of 2030 agenda, as currently countries lag behind its peers. IMF's SDG costing methodology in a very interesting paper reveals that for 5 core sectors alone, in particular education, health, electricity, and water and sanitation, Pakistan needs annual spending of about 16% of GDP, over and above the normal growth of public expenditures. Hence my appeal that we have to go for 30% investment GDP ratio. And I will tackle as to how we go about it. Education and health sector alone need additional 5% of GDP investment if we have to improve the productivity and efficiency. And infrastructure at large requires about 8% of GDP annually, which is an estimate that I have from another work that we had done. So the quick question is, how can this be financed? Of course, IMF estimates tax potential of about 20 to 22% of GDP, and that has also been reinforced by some other work of the World Bank, and the reform of the FBR are underway. But for this purpose, we would need expansion in the tax base. And of course, a good step of the property revaluation is underway, but there's a lot that needs to be done. I will not go into the individual details of the tax reforms that we need. The second point that the second financing area is that we have to develop and nurture green and sustainable finance for development by positioning regulators to recognize climate as a real risk to financial stability and required financial institutions to submit technical and financial disclosure of projects. Green financing needs to be incentivized through standardized macroprudential policy regulations, which involve, of course, recognizing that you need to have recognize the green financing relative to the brown financing through appropriate cushions, either through relaxation of the capital buffers or additional capital buffers, as may be the case. A third area of how we finance is where I'm sitting today, which is the Pakistan Stock Exchange, which offers an opportunity to our industry to raise equity and debt financing. And we have established a new GEM market, which has been operationalized. It allows for listing of SMEs to raise both debt and equity capital. Good news is, after a bit of a few years of a lull, we have had new equity and debt issues of a decent number, but our KPIs this year include about 10 new equity and debt issues to be listed within this fiscal year. PSX, for some of you who may not know and may remember, is that an old broker-led setup, is now corporatized and demutualized exchange with 40% shareholding by the most world-class Chinese 3 stock exchanges, and of course our local partner, which is the Habib Bank Limited, which has 25 branches overseas. Governance of PSX board has been strengthened, and it now includes 3 new independent members, which of course includes me as the chair of the PSX. PSX has now launched the National Trading and Surveillance System, which we have bought from Shenzhen. Despite setbacks, a renewed momentum has helped raise Pakistan Stock Exchange market cap to about $45.65 trillion. Product diversification is underway with 4 exchange-traded funds, ETFs, launched by reputable banks, and a similar number are awaiting in the pipeline. Pakistan market is attractive given its average price-earning ratios of 9.29, and these are latest numbers, and the average dividend yield of 5.57. There has been a little setback because of the bad macroeconomic news coming and the delays in IMF. That is why these numbers are a little lower. Working closely with our subsidiaries, the CDC and the National Clearing System, PSX has now positioned to tap investments in Roshan digital account launched earlier in the year. So we have an investment platform for the securities market now. So PSX has potential also to join the club of 100 sustainable stock exchanges, which would allow us to encourage sustainable investment. I am shortly going to be launching work in this area. PSX will be a platform for companies to mobilize financing through SDGs, green and nature performance bonds. We already reward a number of companies that are compliant with handful of the SDGs. Let me talk of another platform with which I am associated, which is Karandas. It has spun off 3 new private providers of finance, which are dealing with inclusive finance and a goal of SDGs. And we also have established and spun off a new entity. It's a unique institution in Pakistan called InfraZamin that is going to be providing credit enhancement for renewable and other ESG compliant projects and companies. We have already operationalized this company. Public investment and improvements in business environment can, of course, help leverage private investment, but our credit enhancement through InfraZamin will help us solidly going forward. Recurrence of 4 waves of pandemic generates undoubtedly uncertainty regarding the frequency and severity of health crisis. And I would be amiss if I didn't recognize Tarandas for actually sponsoring not only the financing for the virus and vaccines, but also financing bits and pieces of the health agenda. It is well recognized that multilateral response to pandemic left much to be desired. Concern prevailing that divergence in vaccination rate across countries and GDP recoveries would magnify the inequalities. For instance, the advanced economies vaccination rate, as we know, estimated by various sources, stands at 65% relative to 2% in low-income countries. And I was reading somewhere in context of Pakistan, World Bank says it's about 12% in Pakistan, the coverage. So there is a growth diversion and there is a diversion of the vaccination rate. So let me conclude. We, of course, have a daunting development challenging agenda, but herein lies a lot of opportunities, and we are gearing ourselves as a country and as private sector. Pakistan needs to find the right balance between financing development and safeguarding debt sustainability, between long-term development objectives and pressing immediate needs, and between investing in people and upgrading infrastructure. So collaboration and cooperation is critical between the domestic think tanks like SDPI, which do incredible work, and of course, UN bodies hold a lot of promise because they are the architects of SDGs. And I played a very small role in the whole process with my team, both at New York as well as in UNESCAP. Lots of UN bodies are doing very specialized work, which is incredible. Concrete examples, of course, is the present SDPI UNESCAP partnership to fiscalize and mainstream sustainable development agenda, ensuring inclusive growth with improved access to social services and promoting equity, gender diversity. We need to push for digital transformation and of course, carbon neutrality. And I've done a piece of work for the G20 think tank for carbon neutrality of the urban municipalities. This is very critical because urban areas generate the largest emissions. So in the same vein, our favorite topic at the UNESCAP was always regional cooperation. It can be harnessed by UN agencies, but also by MDPs with real money to promote the trade in the region and deal with cross-border natural and economic shocks, as well as contain the pollution and whatever we were doing in UNESCAP, such as the sandstorms and other things. So mobilizing, to me, climate action is very critical part of SDGs because that's what enhances resilience of SDGs. So few initiatives that I am affiliated with, you may not have heard. One is the Pakistan Environment Trust Fund, for which I am an advisor or whatever designations they have. And there we have invited the various companies to commit themselves for net zero emissions, and they went all the way to Glasgow to declare themselves focused on carbon net zero carbon emissions. There is also, we are working on the carbon market and carbon pricing. So there's a lot of work that's going on that frontier. We are also working on the platform of the Pakistan Institute of Corporate Governance that I'm chair of, and also the PSX, to attract institutional investors. We have launched the first ESG initiative for Pakistan corporate sector. And when time permits, I'll be able to introduce you to this. It's a task force that I am chairing with all our companies, as well as it's Pakistan companies plus also international multinational companies. It's a very important piece of work. It will help Pakistan companies, particularly the export-oriented companies, to be able to safeguard themselves should the foreign buyers demand compliance with the ESG standards. Encouraging Pakistani firms as well as government entities and households to access to EGS at world prices to achieve environmental benefits by gradually reducing import duties on EGS and eliminating services trade restrictions on associated environmental services is critical for us to secure market access in various export-oriented sectors of the economy. There's a lot of technical stuff behind it, but also since I've been involved, and this is the last initiative in which I've been working on, which is the debt restructuring. Of course, we all know about the debt service suspension initiative, and we also know that debt service suspension was stretched for almost 2 years now, or a bit less. But the common debt framework leaves much to be desired. For those who may know, the problem is that a lot of countries have borrowed from private sector and also from multilaterals, and they are outside the net of the debt service suspension. And we have done a major study along with some of the other authors to actually advocate for extension of the debt service suspension initiative, but more so for bringing in the private borrowers in the net of the common debt framework treatment, because I think we need to really tackle the greening of the economy through the financing, through debt swaps, but also through green recovery funds. So my last sentence is that Pakistan must adopt SDGs in all, and all in SDGs approach has to be incorporated in the design and implementation policies for transition to inclusive, green, and forward-looking recovery. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I have tried to pull together what I have been involved in, but I'm sure you all are involved in much more serious business, because I operate on my own in Pakistan right now without being affiliated with any entity. But I'm involved in a lot of debates internationally to strengthen the multilateral system. Over to you, Dr. Sajid Amin.
Man, thank you so very much. Such a comprehensive, I can call it OD reforms agenda of Pakistan. I mean, it's very difficult to pick any points. It was so, every point is such a powerful and such a relevant point. Giving it a summary is a very difficult task, really. But just 3 key points, if I pick up on. The one is your last point exactly, SDGs and all in SDGs approach, that let's bring SDGs at the center of, at the heart of this recovery from the COVID-19. The second and most important in context of Pakistan, that is the macroeconomic stability or macroeconomic position. And we have been talking that Pakistan was in a unique position when the COVID hit. We were in the economic meltdown, and we are again in the unique position when it is time to recover, when it needs to time to investments. Pakistan is preparing for expenditures that we are trying to push to increase actually. So this is where macroeconomic position stability becomes a very critical. And finally, I think one of the key challenges that you have highlighted, and this is Hamza has been, but a very comprehensive on climate action, ESGs, and on the final, I really it's good to see that our closing plenary, today's last plenary of this conference, is on ESG exactly. So this we share some common agenda that the initiative have been talking about. Malik for
Sajid, we can't hear you.
We lost him.
Yeah, so I'm not the only one. Okay.
I think it's not
Bandwidth
very
is
clear.
low. Yeah.
The bandwidth is low. Yeah.
He wants you to take over and deliver your presentation. I think this was the crux which I have heard.
I think I am back. Can you hear me? I'm sorry for technical glitches
Yes,
that we are
yes.
having.
Now it's clear.
Hamza, over to you for your presentation. Please, I
Okay.
was just telling that you are actually the curator of all the work that we have been doing over the last 1.5 years. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Sajid. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can, please.
Okay. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good afternoon from Bangkok. It's a privilege, honor to be in the company of old teachers like Dr. Alia, who I've been told is in the audience, my mentor and ex-boss, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, whom I have privileged to work both at Central Bank and at UNESCAP. Several friends like Sajid, Imtiaz, Nadia, across the board, Ashfaq, Tola. There are so many old friends here. So good to be in the company of mentors, teachers, and friends. And I'm sure there are many students there as well. So I've prepared deliberately a little longer presentation, but I won't present all of them today. What I'll do is I'll share my slides with Sajid, with SDPI, with a request to circulate them to all the students and participants later on as notes to go on in more detail and their references for further investigation. It's a very data-oriented, very modeling-oriented work that we have done. And I'm very happy to be able to partner. We are very happy to be able to partner with SDPI and apply the modeling work that we have done in case of Pakistan, both in terms of fiscal responses as a response to COVID-19 and both in terms of moving towards resilient economies and sustainable development goals. So let me start. I'll try and highlight 4 key areas and there are 4 key messages. The number one, I'll show from the data from Asia Pacific region that the impact of COVID-19 was amplified due to the lack of investments in people and existing structural vulnerabilities. So policy choices actually matter quite a bit. And we have gathered evidence for over 60 years for about 50 countries from Asia Pacific region to make this particular point. Economic recovery alone, which is currently underway in most economies, will not be sufficient to build resilience and achieve SDGs. Significant investments are needed in people and planet. Now, policymakers can improve economic growth prospects and reap notable social and environment benefits simultaneously. This, to me, is a very innovative evidence that we have managed to put together because the typical debate is once you go further, there are going to be some trade-off between growth versus inequality and so on and so forth. What we are showing is over time, we can actually have what we call a build forward policy package that can deliver on all 3 fronts. It's a macroeconometric model, so we can play with these equations for country-specific features and priorities. And last but not least, of course, investing in different policy proposals require financial resources. So I'll discuss briefly what are several policy options that at least the areas where ESCAP is working with several member states in the region. The issue is they need to be aligned with SDGs in climate action, which is not the case at this point in time. So this is a very short part. So I talk about the present, past, and future. So in terms of present, I'll be very brief because this is not the focus of discussion today. All I'm saying is COVID-19 basically is a very stark reminder, not the only one, not the first one, but the latest one, that health emergencies or other unexpected shocks pose significant social damages and economic risks. So this is how the situation looks when we look at the GDP growth in the region. These are the sub-regional dynamics. You want to look at the green line, which is for South Asia. So it was the worst hit sub-region in the entire Asia Pacific, hitting the rock bottom in June 2020. And since then, you can see that most of the sub-regions are actually in the recovery mode and now registering positive economic growth as we close, as of mid-2021 at least. The Outlook is looking pretty decent at the moment. I won't discuss the factors based on which, or assumptions based on which we are making these forecasts. But the point is, they're pretty much the same what we were saying in April when we published our economic and social survey in end of March 2021. So about 6.8 in 2021 and about 5.1 in 2022. But that's not the point. The point is, despite this recovery, there have already been significant socioeconomic costs and losses. So these are the estimates, for instance, the full-time job losses. These are picked up from the ILO data, and we have adjusted them from UNESCAP region. So 140 million jobs have been lost in 2020 alone in Asia Pacific region, most of them in South Asia. Similarly, and we did some original work in the context of estimating the impact on poverty, looking at existing methodologies. In our estimate, there are about 89 million people across Asia Pacific region that have been pushed back into extreme poverty because of COVID only in 2020. The number of people will go up if we use different metric of $3.2 a day or $5.5 a day. These estimates we are revisiting for next survey, so the idea is to keep updating them and see where we stand. But more importantly, there have been what we call permanent losses that are already there. So blue line is something where we would have been, the region, Asia Pacific region as a whole, and this dotted line is something, is our estimate, our forecast where the region is going to be, or is for the next 3 years. COVID, 2020, 21, and 22. So across the Asia Pacific region, our estimates are $2.6 trillion have already been lost, and they're unlikely to be recovered. It has consequences for poverty, inequality, resources available to invest in SDGs, and so on and so forth, which I'll elaborate a bit more. At the same time, in addition to losses, the real risk is K-shaped recovery, both across countries and within economies. The key factors we have identified in distinguishing between developed and developing countries. For instance, vaccination orders and availability of vaccination. Huge difference between developed versus developing countries. Fiscal resources, 24% of GDP versus maximum of 6% in developing countries. Access to distance learning, because everything is now moved online, right? Again, huge difference between advanced countries and poor countries. And similarly, the chances for teleworking, opportunities for teleworking are also limited in developing countries. So this is going to increase the gap between advanced countries and developing countries as we move forward. To me, is one of the fundamental risks that the region faces. And similar understanding can be developed within economies. In some projects, we are actually working with countries on that. Moving to the main thrust of today's talk, dealing with resilience. That's something, so we took the COVID pandemic as one shock and then say, okay, what can we learn from all previous episodes of shocks, crises, different crises, economic and non-economic, that Asia Pacific has faced? And what lessons can we draw in terms of policy? In simple words, which policies work, which don't? Can we identify a few policies that countries should have in place if they want to move forward? So before we go to the move forward, we wanted to draw lessons from the past. So this is the basic simple framework we looked at. We're looking at 4 different kind of shocks: financial crisis, terms of trade shocks, natural disasters, and epidemics. In total, we looked at 450 episodes of these shocks since 1960, between 1960 and 2018. And we also looked at the structural factors of different economies. I'll mention them in the next slide and the next coming slides, and pre and post-crisis policy choices. And then we developed what we call impulse responses or medium-term impacts. What happened after these shocks in those countries in this context, diversifying from the impact of shocks. So shocks and how the policies come together, we discern the impact on key indicators of sustainable development along 3 dimensions of economic, social, and environment. So this is, you want to look at the left-hand panel, which is the Asia Pacific landscape of risk. It's a wide risk scape. So you can see the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000 to present. Blue lines are financial crises, orange is terms of trade shock, green is natural disasters, and I think purple is the pandemics. You can easily see the number of shocks being experienced by Asia Pacific region have actually gone up since 2000, in particularly the terms of trade shocks, right? So this is a snapshot of the kind of shocks we have looked at. What happens is when we do the analysis, and there are several other kind of these similar graphs you can see in our report. So adverse shocks have long-term scars. This is a very fundamental point, and I'll drive this point home towards the end as well. Investment slowdown, for instance, from financial crises across the region. You can see the impact lasts for about 5 years, and even then economies do not recover the permanent impact of financial crises on investments. Similarly, on inequalities, inequalities go up by about 0.2. This is a Gini coefficient we have used after pandemics. So we are likely to see higher inequalities in the region in the context of current pandemic. Similarly, the impact of environment damages in case of natural disasters is also huge. The point is, and I've picked these 3 indicators only: investment as an economic representative, inequality, and environment damages. The shocks leave permanent scars. It is important to invest in resilience. That's my point. As important as it is to invest in growth. I'll come back to this point. So policy choices can reduce these setbacks. So we looked at the array of policy choices. The standard ones, economic policies, right? We looked at fiscal policy, fiscal space, the spending priorities, other spending in health, education, infrastructure, so on and so forth. Similarly, for monetary and financial policies, the exchange rate regime being pursued, the external financial flows, and the structural features. These are the 4 key structural features we looked at in terms of data. Health and social protection system, how much countries are actually spending in these systems. Infrastructure quality, we developed an index for that. Economic diversification indicator, and governance and institution indicators. And then we simply assess the performance of countries who had different policies paths or different structural features in their countries. So this is one of the graphs, and there are several you can see in the report. So policy choices in country matters, right? Simple example, look at the left-hand graph, which is GDP per capita. So again, the 4 bars are 4 different kinds of shocks. You can easily see them: financial crisis, trade shocks, natural disasters, and epidemics. And then what we did was we simply separated the more resilient economies and less resilient economies, a medium-term impact. And how do we define more and less? Well, any country that was above the 50 percentile, we call it a more resilient, less than 50 percentile, less resilient. So you can literally eyeball and look at it and simply see in more resilient economies, the recovery in terms of GDP per capita is better. The impact on poverty is actually lower. Environment performance is better, right? And I'm not going in the details, kind of which policies and so on and so forth. As I keep saying, there are details and appendices available if you want to look at those kind of things. So it's very visual that countries that have resilience, in simple terms, countries that have an ability to absorb and respond effectively to shocks, fare better in the medium term. Medium term means 5 years after the shock. So both in terms of GDP per capita, extreme poverty, environment performance, countries who have actually invested in people, in resilience, in improving the structural problems, actually fare better when they are faced by shocks. This is the evidence from the region. This is another way of, just to make the point home, because we're talking about COVID context, so I thought I'll pull out at least one graph for pandemics. So this is a similar graph presented differently, but only for pandemics. So pandemics have a far more severe economic and social impact in countries with pre-existing structural vulnerabilities. So there are 3 examples I've taken: public health spending, work arrangements, whether they're formal versus informal, and the quality of infrastructure. So the blue lines are showing if the countries are spending higher public health spending, have formal work arrangements, and have high quality infrastructure. And brown is the other way around. And I've looked 3 indicators here for illustration: GDP per capita, consumption impact, and human capital. And again, I don't need to explain, I can just simply show you those countries that have high public health spending, their GDP per capita improves better compared to those that don't. Same is the case for consumption, same is the case for human capital formation. So what are the key lessons? And as I said, there are literally dozens of these kind of graphs that are available in the appendix in the report itself. I thought, well, let's draw out key lessons for today. First lesson: respond strongly and swiftly to shocks to safeguard sustainable development. This is a fundamental lesson. You really have to set aside some of the conventional economic wisdom. If it calls for fiscal spending, do the fiscal spending, deal with the consequences later. Unconventional monetary policies, for instance, have been used in 2008 crisis globally, right? This is showing the impact of these kind of policies, the potential boost to sustainable development from resilient enhancing policies. Again, 5 years after the crisis, more resilient economies relative to less resilient economies. So we can actually see that those countries that actually responded aggressively, their GDP per capita was 3 percentage points higher. In case of financial crisis, roughly the same for natural disasters, and about 5 percentage points higher in case of epidemics. Same can be said for human capital environment performance. This is just another way of demonstrating if countries respond strongly and quickly and to shocks, well, they reap actually the benefits in the medium term for sure. Lesson number 2, and this is something I think Dr. Akhtar was touching upon as well. We need to move away from very conventional optimization approach to policy making, the trade-off approach. The first order conditions we teach students in classes. We need to get much more risk management approach into policy making. It's a very different framework and model. Maybe they can have a separate seminar, how countries and academics now are revisiting the very economic theoretical foundation for policies to actually bring in risk elements. These are just examples what we see from the data. So you have to have coping with risk ability and preparing for the crisis. Develop early warning system, climate resilient infrastructure, adaptive social protection, and so on and so forth. Right? Third lesson is we just wanted to plot what is the performance of countries across different categories. So the orange bar on the left is the least developed countries in Asia and the Pacific. The middle one, which is yellow, is other developing countries in Asia Pacific, and we compared them with the OECD countries, the dark brown bar. And we again selected few indicators. So sovereign credit rating index, exchange rate flexibility index, social protection spending, infrastructure quality, economic complexity as examples. And again, it's pretty visual. Those countries that actually, so developing countries are, least developed countries are least developed because they don't have enough exchange rate flexibility. They're not spending enough on social protection. They have poor quality infrastructure. The sovereign credit rating is poor. Their economic complexity actually is pretty far off. So these are the ideas and indicators of the kind of policy areas policymakers should zoom in if they want to improve the prospects of the countries. So this is all learned from the past. So how do we translate all that learning into the future? What elements of the policies we're proposing that countries now pursue as they move forward? So we propose what we call a build forward policy package, which looks like this. This is a 46-country macroeconometric model, has 3 components. One is social services, which essentially has 2 subcomponents, access to healthcare and social protection flow. Second is digital access. ICT investments and education spending are 2 examples of that. And third is a very detailed module of green development. And we have equations for biodiversity, subsidies, carbon pricing, clean energy and energy efficiency, and so on and so forth. And the model is quite flexible, which means it can be adapted to different country circumstances, different policy priorities. If country X, like say Pakistan, wants to focus only on green development aspects and carbon taxation, well, the model can modify that, and you can get a lot of insights and details by plugging in actually those kind of features for the Pakistani data. We actually held a joint workshop with SDPI on 25th November, where we engaged with Planning Commission economists, and Sajid told me later on, the Ministry of Finance economists were involved as well. Dr. Imtiaz is here. Maybe his team is familiar. We have basically took them on a training to teach them how to use the model in e-views and play for themselves and figure out different policies. So here is some illustrative example of that. So transformations offer notable socioeconomic and environment benefits. This is for South Asia as a sub-region whole. So black bar is ambitious spending, and we define ambitious spending means countries actually invest whatever the needed amount is for SDG investments. And UNESCAP has done SDG costing in 2019, so we have those kind of estimates already. So we assume, what if countries actually invest all that is needed, what happens? So number of poor people go down drastically, 120 million by 2030. Inequality goes down, air quality improves, carbon emissions improves, and you can pick up other indicators as well that are in the model. Business as usual, and I'll show you what that means, which means if you continue to spend what you're spending at this point in time, on average, the region is spending about 38% of what is needed on average. Some countries are investing far less, some are more. On average, it's about 1/3. And if they do that, of course, the benefits are not as stark as you see in the initial investment. Now, as an economist, if you understand, nothing comes for free. If you want to invest, if you want to spend on those priority areas, you need resources, financial resources. So first of all, we see the impact on the debt position of countries. And our estimates, about 66% of SDGs will have to be financed from fiscal resources. So the major impact of investing in SDGs is going to come from fiscal side, and it's going to have an impact on debt, and as a consequence, debt sustainability. So on average, the developing Asia Pacific will experience its debt to GDP ratio go from about 50% to more than 70, about 72, 73%. If you want to do just the Build Forward Better package, or also include the impact of the recent COVID spendings as well. The right-hand panel is the same one for South and Southwest Asia as a region. And again, as I said, if you want to do the Pakistan estimates, the model allows you to do that as well. These are significant increases in about, in this modeling work, at least about 10 years. Where are you going to come up with the resources to finance this increased debt? That is, of course, ultimate policy question. And I'll be very quick on that before we conclude. I won't go into the details of all the policies, simply mention them. So this is how the fiscal situation looks in the Asia Pacific region. Obviously, it has worsened quite a bit. It was close to about 1.5% on average before the pandemic, and now it's hovering close to 6% and likely to come down in the next few years. So fiscal deficit is likely to remain elevated for the time being. So on the one hand, you want to spend more, which is going to increase the debt level. At the same time, your fiscal space has already been constrained because you're already running high deficits. So you really need to think out of the box where you're going to come from these resources. And to add insult to injury, this is, to me, one of the most fundamental and important graphs, and it took us really quite some effort to put it together. So I show it in several workshops, especially when talking about country level work that we do. Left-hand panel is the additional SDG investment costing we have done in some country cases, the country level. So for Pakistan, this is about 16.9% of the GDP, which is very similar to IMF estimates, not surprisingly, because when we were doing the estimates, we actually engaged with ADB, IMF, World Bank, several other agencies. So the methodologies were not that different in many cases. The advantage of our approach is it covers all areas of SDGs, not just some selected areas. So 16 point or about 17% of GDP is required. How much countries are actually doing? So we did the mapping of that, where the financial resources are coming and where are they going towards different SDG areas. So we did two scenarios on the right-hand side. If we assume the financial flows going towards SDGs are going to increase by 2%, which is the actual growth in the last 5 years, between 16 and 19, Pakistan is spending less than 1% of GDP. If you really give them benefit of doubt, certainly they're going to start spending a lot toward SDGs, and they more than double the financial flows. They go from 2% to 5%. They'll still reach not even 3%. So basically, it's an impossible task. I don't think so. Many countries in the region, including Pakistan, stands a chance to achieve SDGs if we only look at one aspect, which is lack of financing available. So this is a seriously fundamental constraint a lot of countries are facing. What are the options? This is where I'll be very, very quick, and because we can have several detailed seminars on each one of them. 3 broader categories of work that we have defined, depending on the areas of work we are working with different countries, different sub-regions. First one, to me, the important one is fiscal position. We need to enhance fiscal space. Several opportunities are there. We are doing some work for, especially in terms of tackling illicit financial flows, for instance, reprioritizing public spending. I keep hearing from developing countries, including Pakistan, that we don't have sufficient fiscal resources. And I always say, I don't think so. We are choosing as a policy issue not to spend on SDGs and continue to spend on defense. It's a policy choice. So if we're choosing to be a security state, we cannot be a development state. It's a stark reality. We just don't admit it in most public forums. We need to come to grips with the reality. You cannot expect to spend huge resources on something that is not supporting SDGs and then somehow expect to come resources and achieve SDGs, right? Because the other option is you're simply going to keep on complaining, I don't have sufficient resources. So I doubt that. So there are a lot of risks here, and we are working, as I said, in some areas with some countries. The second category is where we are quite actively working now is innovative and sustainable financing instruments. The 2 key areas are thematic bonds, especially green bonds, and mostly recently social bonds as well, working with several ASEAN countries, and debt for climate swaps. We're working with a lot of Pacific Island economies in these areas. These are in a way untapped potential markets where you can raise a lot of funding, which is not happening at the moment. There are huge pension funds in the region which are sitting on piles and piles of assets, and they're looking for investments. Dr. Akhtar referred to that, ESG kind of investments. The frameworks, the standards, the taxonomies are not there, which can attract those kind of investments in those areas. So for Indonesia, for instance, we are working with Luxembourg because the investors want to invest there and simply trying to facilitate those kind of things. Carbon pricing is another area we are quite actively working, again, with ASEAN economies. And these are some examples of regional cooperation which we are promoting, including on debt architecture and debt sustainability issues. We are holding a global conference in March 2022 with Pacific leaders. And then there are a lot of work we are doing on standardizing, in a way, sustainable financing, ESG investments kind of frameworks, both for thematic bonds and ESG investments also. And same thing for debt swaps. So bottom line, last slide. Policymakers should assess the wider risk assessment, wider risk landscape, and focus on reducing setbacks, which essentially means building resilience, as well as accelerating progress. Bulk of macroeconomic literature and the bulk of focus of policymakers tends to be on GDP growth, how we can grow faster. And they tend to forget it is very important to have the ability to reduce the setback as and when you encounter shocks, as COVID just made it very amply clear. So for that, the bottom line, the build forward package essence is basically invest in people and planet. I personally think, and this is a research theme we have been pushing quite deliberately in our research in UNESCAP, and pandemic makes it a more stark, that we really need to revisit and rethink the development pathways, the very fundamentals, assumptions of macroeconomic theory in many ways, to essentially build forward better, right? The old school of focus only on economic growth and then somehow redistribute that pie, then deal with economic environment consequences. It's a very old version of the thinking. We really have to simultaneously consider these multiple dimensions and figure out the trade-offs that are involved as and when we pursue them. And bilkul ho gaya ji, bilkul ho gaya. And I have briefly mentioned several policy options as well, both on the fiscal side and on the financing side for your consideration. Happy to discuss further. Here are some resources. Most of this work is drawn from the 2021 issue of Economic and Social Survey of Asia Pacific, and some financing work is actually discussed in detail in our Financing for Development series number 4, which was just published in October a couple of months ago. Thank you once again, Sajid. I'm sure in his presentation, Sajid will show, hopefully, some of the translation of the modeling work that we have done for Pakistan and what kind of results we see in case of Pakistan. Thank you once again for the opportunity for this collaboration. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Hamza. ये हो गया है, हमने नहीं कहा था, ये किसी और ने कहा.
I know, just kidding.
and thank you for a very wonderful presentation. While you have consumed much of my time as well, so not left much to add on this one, but it was a very well consumed time. I mean, you really set the context, a very broader context for the discussion that we will be having, but it will be challenging now we will be challenging the summary skills of our panelists, how they can kind of in 7 minutes they can bring. But let me just quickly run down. I'll reduce my time. Now I'll be inviting myself. Can I share screen? Can you see, please, screen? Great. Thank you. So I'll just run down on what we have done. These are exactly the 3 key messages that I think are echoing across all 3 presentations so far. Financing needs are huge, fiscal space is low, and this really goes back to what Dr. Hamza was saying, that priorities matter, policies matter, and I think they matter more when you have a very limited resources. So what you prioritize to spend those resources really matters. And definitely the key message is coming that we need to adopt SDGs as the central guiding framework, taking us to inclusive, green, and forward-looking recovery. So this is just a quick summary of what we have done in our work. Hamza has already laid it down very well, so I'll just skip and move forward. The broader idea is it proposes some possible options to enhance fiscal space as well as to align recovery to SDGs agenda, particularly done for Pakistan. These are 2 studies and 1 macroeconomic model that came out of this 1.5-year work. Pakistan responding to the pandemic put in place a fiscal stimulus of 1.2 trillion. And according to UNESCAP, it was roughly half of what was required, given the low social protection, higher prevalence of poverty, inequality, and other things. So much higher was needed. But definitely, as I told in earlier, under IMF program of facing a very tight fiscal and monetary policies, this was much Pakistan could do. But exactly this was worth doing. I'll just give you one scenario that if you can see the red blocks at the bottom, the circles, the no fiscal support, that actually aligns. What if there was no fiscal stimulus Pakistan didn't have put in place? So it really, if you can see the first bar, minus 3.7, the loss of GDP to the base was minus 3.7 instead of reported by the government minus 0.48. There are debates though that was it the higher number or lower, but this clearly shows that it contributed, the fiscal stimulus contributed, and most of them came from, the biggest impact was coming from the social transfers, the social spendings that government did have. In absence of any fiscal support, poverty would have been higher, unemployment would have been higher. So it means spending on people, the social spending has a very strong case. And this is what again goes back to the point that Dr. Hamza said, that COVID-19 has highlighted that health is a macroeconomic crisis now. And this really puts social spending as a very strong economic case. They are not an act of benevolence or the residual policy. They are now, and they should be, at the center of the spending priorities because they have a productivity growth and they contribute to your GDP, they contribute to employment and reducing poverty. So COVID has actually given a very strong economic case for the social spending. So this is some of the work. We have a very detailed analysis in the full report that we'll be sharing. But the measures of fiscal stimulus have a direct or indirect impact on a large, wide range of SDGs targets. And this is just a very quick summary of transfer to low-income households. And they have impact on poverty, hunger, and other. And we have also given the major transmission channels. We hope this can help better assessment of moving forward, that how the social spendings can help achieve the SDGs agenda in itself. Actually, they are at the core of the SDGs agenda. So these are just quick 4 proposals for Pakistan, and more aligned and almost similar to what Hamza has said. Pakistan must increase social spending and expand social protection as a major economic policy decisions. Actually, it should be the central economic policy, not as a residual policy, right? It is now. Pakistan must continue to push for mass vaccination. This is what Dr. Shamshad has highlighted also. And this is very critical for countries like Pakistan, where informal sector is hugely, overwhelmingly prevalent. And most of the implied labor there, or most of the work there is requires in-person presence, and absence of a vaccination, we can keep sort of blocks, and the lockdowns are the obstacles to the continuity of the work. We'll keep, because as Dr. Shamshad said, we will continue to have these new mutants coming. So vaccination will be critical, and vaccination inequality actually will be leading to economic inequality and other forms of inequalities. And balanced green funding in order to ensure transition towards green recovery is critical. And finally, if it has to forward looking, this is the digital transformation is central. And this is what Dr. Shamshad Sahib also highlighted, that the impact of COVID-19 was differentiated across the different segments of society. And so were the gains from the fiscal policy responses or the stimulus. So this will be a critical to have a digital transformation or digitization. So impact of, this is exactly the model that we have done. The impact of social spending on social protection, health, and education. We do both financing and non-financing criteria. I mean, if there are no financing constraints, and if there are financing constraints, the orange color gives when there are financing constraints, financed. But in all cases, if you see, GDP increases, the impact on inflation is there, impact on GDP, debt is lower in the long run. It reduces its minor impact, because we are assuming that much of this kind of the fiscal space can be created by reducing the inefficiencies. I'll be just showing some numbers. Unemployment rate declines actually by a good percentage point to the base in the absence if we spend on and it reduces the poverty rate as well. Hamza has also given some numbers, and these are the good numbers for Pakistan as well. And particularly this is in Pakistan, it has even the double importance that when we are going through a going back to a tight monetary and tight fiscal policy, social spendings will be very critical, particularly on the social protection in the short run, and then health and education in the medium to long term. So we net gain are positive spending on the social protection and health and education. Similarly, investing in green recovery has a very strong economic case for Pakistan. So far, the discussion in Pakistan on green investments is more or less a kind of a case for that it improves environment, it improves nature. But at the same time, it has a very strong economic case. There is very growing evidence that $1 spent in fossil fuels produces 1 job, but that in renewable energy produces 7.4 jobs. And these can be a number also coming from the Pakistan, because it effectively reduces unemployment rates. At the same time, this is what Hamza was also saying, that it reduces the environmental adverse impacts. And if you see bottom last 2 bars, it hugely reduces impact on air pollution and impact on carbon emissions. It reduces poverty rate, increases employment, reduces unemployment rate, and impact on GDP in terms of percentage difference from the base is very strong. And it grows as you move. You make investments right now, you gain for the longer periods, and the collective gains are much higher. So this is where the financing needs come, that where you will be having the financing coming from. If currently Pakistan is spending roughly 0.6% on social protection, and it needs roughly 2.76 points. So you need to have a 2.14% of GDP additional, and so this is how it goes in terms of education and health as well, if you see. So there is a huge investments requirements, definitely. And this is where the difficult challenges for countries like Pakistan comes, where there is a very limited fiscal space. So this is if you have to, Pakistan needs to balance green recovery, but financing needs for green transportation only by 2030 are $38.5 billion, roughly $3.85 a year by till 2030. But this is also possibility that there's a good share coming from the private sector. The 13.5 billion are expected or estimated potential to be coming from the private sector, and we have this incorporated this in the model as well. And this is a flexible model. You can change this ratio and see what is happening to the debts and other economic indicators. Finally, again, for the digital recovery, Pakistan need till 2030 $56.6 billion. Sounds a huge amount. The public sector has to come with the $20.6 billion, and $34 billion can come from, there is a potential estimated under different scenarios and different studies can come from the private sector. But overall, as Hamza and Dr. Shamshad has already highlighted, that this remains a kind of the fiscal space is remain to be limited there. So that is why you have to have some innovative ideas, green bonds, social impact bonds, and debt swaps. This one, not much is expected from the kind of FBR tax revenues, if history is any guide. But I'll just cutting it down, improving tax base. For example, I'll just give one example, that there is a huge space for non-FBR taxes. You know, if you can see the right left green part, the total property tax revenue built in for this year's budget is around 210 billion, 210 billions for the Pakistan across the year, fiscal year. Only Mumbai collected in Pakistani rupee terms 120 billion of property tax. And from Karachi, it was around 1.73 billions. Number may vary from different sources. I'm sure Ashfaq Tola Sahab can guide us much more. But it is just to highlight that there is a huge space. So don't tell that there is no margin for revenue increase in Pakistan. There are many revenues. This is only where Dr. Hamza's point comes again, that this is the political will that you need to get through it. Only property tax can give a huge amount in terms of revenues. Saving even transport and energy sector efficiencies can create huge resources. In 2000, country roughly spent 1.7 billion and 0.2 billion on the coal and oil subsidies. If you can cut them 35% or the 50% and gradually 75%, they can save you more than $1 billion a year. Again, in energy and sectors, roughly 4 to 6% of GDP can be saved. And this is roughly $12.5 billion to around $19 billion. So if you can save only 35% of them, so this can give you around $11 billion a year. So a green recovery is even creating space of fiscal space within the sector as well. The political commitment will be the critical. Similarly, this is the final, that exports, we have put it in the medium to long term because definitely it will take. But if we can increase only in next 3 to 4 years our exports from currently 9% around to 14%, this can create an additional amount of $19 billion a year. And the higher scenarios is also there, but the minimum scenario 1 can be can give you fiscal space. So these are some of the out of box that Pakistan has been thinking, have already been covered: green stimulus, green Yo bond, debt for nature, ecosystem restoration fund, but they need to be scaled up at a very low scale right now. So this is some of the work on which this presentation has been based. We have been doing with UNESCAP and some other collaborations. Thank you. I'm sorry, I have taken still more time than allocated to me. Thank you. So let me now, with the permission of the chair, invite our panelists for the discussion. So let me begin. As I was just told that Dr. Ashfaq Tola Sahab has to go actually, and still we have. I'm sure he is already late. The time he actually gave us. Sir, we are so thankful to you for staying with us. Sir, you can pick on any point while. But it will be good how to finance. I've been following your very recent work on living without IMF and creating fiscal spaces. So I think this can be a good point to start, that how we can finance this recovery, and particularly without IMF, that will be very critical. Over to you, sir.
Dr. Shamshad, Akhtar, Hamza, and I think economists, Pakistan, those who have grip on Pakistan's economy, and Hamza is now, I mean, I think when I met him last, he was having a grip in Pakistan's economy, but now he's having a grip on the regional economy, and I'm happy to know, and I can see a future finance minister in him for Pakistan. Hamza, very well done, and I'm extremely grateful to SDPI for inviting me on this session, where we have got 3 very important presentations before we start or we trigger this discussion on the resilience of recovery of economy. I mean, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar has always been second to none. Was really very thoughtful. Hamza, practical, and I know he's a practical guy like me, and obviously he gives a practical solution. Sajid Saab, you always prefer to give a very decent talk, and I know you. Your last moderation on the seminar was also very good. But let me just tell you As Hamza has said, I'll take it forward for the rest of the panelists to discuss. Actually, I have to go to a funeral prayers of one of our good friend. His mother passed away. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. So I'm going there. Nonetheless, I'm giving you a brief presentation or maybe some food for thought. As you said, Dr. Sajid, that I wrote an article on how to survive without IMF. I know it's a bitter pill to swallow when you have got a chair like Dr. Shamshad and he'll vehemently oppose this, without IMF you can't do. Nonetheless, this is something which we need to understand, which we need to think. Obviously, I know there are most of the world who is surviving IMF, but it is not the end of the world. We know that we have to digest some important or bitter things when we are in the program of IMF. Nonetheless, in my humble view, we have seen so many IMF programs in the last 2 decades, and we have seen a lot of recoveries during the program as well. But this time we are unfortunate that we were unable to manage those recoveries. I mean, we all have to agree this. My point is, I wrote this article first in February 2020, and it was a thought-provoking for the then Finance Minister, Dr. Abid, is like an elder brother, but really वो मुझ पे नाराज हो गए, बोले यार तुमने लिखा क्यों है? So I said कि सर माफ करते हैं, मेरी गलती हो गई है. Now again, with this chaos happening in the economy of Pakistan, I think, this was my duty to just give just a thought to the policymakers. But I know they have deaf ears and they will not listen to or they will not read to me. No problem. I'll just keep on hearing my views. देखिए हमारी economy जो है उसके बड़े important dynamics है. Dr. Hamza must have seen so many economies in the world. Dr. Shamshad, obviously, she knows so many countries. But our economy has a different dynamics. We have got a huge parallel base of economy. And that is the bottleneck of our recovery. Let me tell you, कोई भी आप step उठा के देख लें, हमारी सारी economy की जो punch line होती है, that boils down to only one thing, that is parallel. We've got a huge parallel base in agriculture, in trading, and especially in real estate. Unless we bring most of it into mainstream economy, we cannot book copy the total model of maybe IMF or maybe any other model which is in place right now in the world. So हमारी जो deviation चाहिए जो हमें, that is because of the parallel economy. And we have done not much in last 2 decades कि आप उसको mainstream economy. ये point था when I was part of Tax Reforms Commission. In fact, I was the one who authored that report. And since 2016, it is in the shelf. आज तक आपके सामने कहीं नहीं आई होगी. डॉक्टर साहबा को तो मैंने दे दिया था when she was finance minister for caretaker setup. Dr. Sajid के पास भी है. But what I'm saying, by and large, we need to implement those taxes. They entail everything about how to recover and how to bring this parallel economy into mainstream economy. So why we are shying away? It is, मैं बड़ा सख्त अल्फाजों में बात करूंगा. I'm sorry, please bear with me. सबसे बड़ा मसला ये है हमारा कि हमारी geopolitical condition तो भले भी कोई हो, मगर हमारी internal political condition is absolutely vulnerable. Our economy is not resilient. We are having an effervescent economy which we are having. कि हम bubbly economy पे travel कर रहे होते हैं bumpy rides के साथ. We go to 5.8, then we come down to -0.3. I share the point of Dr. Sajid. मुझे एक चीज समझ नहीं आ रही थी when we just look at those political statements of our honorable leaders like Prime Minister even, that हम अगर close कर देंगे तो हमारी economy बहुत मार खाएगी. From March 2020 till June 30th, 2020, virtually we all have to agree कि वो virtually closure था पाकिस्तान के लिए. Am I right, sir? जब वो closure था, so just look at the GDP figure. Hamza, it's a thought provoking for you. My GDP given mean, 2020 was minus point, and the revision is minus 0.47. So in one quarter, the difference is only 0.09%. What is the cost of shutdown? And then from there, I picked Dr. Sajid that the actual negative GDP growth was much more than that. My estimate was 2.2, but he is a step ahead to me. When we estimated this minus 0.38 in April, I was criticized by none other than my own friends that this is a biased opinion. I said, no, this is a real opinion and time will tell. When the figure of 0.38, negative figure was declared by the government, I was sitting with Dr. Ashfaq and I said, कि मेरे figure का 40वां हुआ है, आपने declare कर दिया कि 0.38. So आपकी जो भी इकोनॉमी है, मैं ये कहता हूँ रियल वर्ल्ड में आपको देखना पड़ेगा और पहले आपको अपने इश्यूज को एड्रेस करना पड़ेगा. I can work out the fancy numbers, बड़े अच्छे ग्राफ में बना के प्रेजेंट कर दूंगा. But what we have in real life, आज हम एक नई चीज सुन रहे होते हैं. मैंने अब्दुल्ला को और आपको भेजा, एक स्क्रीन में उधर शेयर कर दें. So this is the reality. हम रेटोरिक दे रहे हैं कि जी दुनिया में महंगाई है. We all know. But can we progress or can we give a bounce back to our economy by following the IMF recipe? I think the answer is no. I mean, we have been given to understand कि हमारी इकोनॉमी बहुत ज्यादा इन्फ्लेटेड है जस्ट बिकॉज ऑफ द फैक्ट कि दुनिया में इन्फ्लेशन है और अर्जेंटाइन में हमसे ज्यादा इन्फ्लेशन है, टर्की में हमसे ज्यादा इन्फ्लेशन है, ब्राजील इज आल्सो अहेड ऑफ अस. बट कैन वी जस्टिफाई दिस इन्फ्लेशन व्हेन वी से दैट व्हाट इज द पर कैपिटा इनकम ऑफ पाकिस्तान, व्हाट इज द परचेजिंग पावर पर कैपिटा इन पाकिस्तान? नो. So we cannot give the example. We have to compare an apple with an apple. Are we on the right track by giving these examples, or we are just making a case out of nothing? The answer is yes, we are making a case out of nothing just to pacify the nation. कि यार हम अकेले नहीं हैं, दुनिया मार खा रही है. But this is not the truth. ठीक है, टर्की की भी आपकी बड़ी डिवैल्यूएशन हुई है, अब अर्जेंटीना की भी काफी हुई है. बट डू यू थिंक कि आर यू कॉम्पिटिटिव इन द रीजन? नेक्स्ट स्लाइड अगर जरा सा अगला पेज दे दें प्लीज. थोड़ा सा मूव कर देंगे डॉक्टर अब्दुल्ला. यस. नाउ जस्ट कंपेयर द रीजन. क्या हम इस रीजन को कंपेयर कर सक रहे हैं? एंड व्हाट इज द सोल रीजन फॉर दैट? इट इज नॉट द महंगाई अलोन. It is not the international commodity prices alone. The main factor is the devaluation. And why we have a devaluation, rampant devaluation at all? Because of the fact we want to follow the principle of greed. Yes, follow it, but follow it rigorously. When we follow it and when we leave everything on demand and supply mechanism, then don't cry over the spoiled milk. आज रील को देख लें, ऑनरेबल फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर इज सेइंग दैट इट इज 164 165 मे बी अराउंड दैट. वो कैलकुलेशन मेरे पास अभी नहीं है. Our official interbank rate is 177 and he is saying that speculators are doing the trick. So what is the purpose of government then? Not to control the speculation or give them a free hand? No. We have a huge parallel economy, as I said. So we cannot follow the model of IMF. And this was crux of my article. That what we have to revisit the interest rates. We have to revisit the currency factor. So rampant devaluation, if we go, Dr. Shamshad, I know you must be laughing at me and you will not spare me next time. But let me just take out my vent. I am venting whatever I have to say. Nonetheless, मैं ये कहता हूँ अभी भी कि I am a proponent और मैंने ये करके दिखाया था in the previous regime. Dr. Sahaba knows this. 111 से हम 94 पे लेके आए थे, and not illegally so. With very much legal factors. Your currency companies, Hamza, you can second me. Your currency companies are allowed to import. Don't second me, but second me that the way I am discussing with you now. This is what Dr. Ishwar Hussain has done in 2000. I know the history, I know the archive, and you can see me at the State Bank since 1992. बात ये है आपको कि कौवा हंस की चाल नहीं चल सकता. Interest rate, every percentage point is causing you 262 billion rupees of fiscal deficit. Can we be comfortable with that? If we are in the program, we have to see certain benchmarks, but at what cost? With this NFC award of when we are dishing out almost 60% to the provinces and GB and Kashmir, can we manage this much of fiscal deficit? No, we cannot. And it is very fancy to say that we have to increase the tax base. Do you know, if we go for Schwarzenegger or maybe zero tax budgeting, you know what is going to be your tax target with this sort of a NFC award? 16,000 billion. Do you have the capacity? 200. When 38.5% of your GDP is not contributing or insignificantly contributing towards your direct tax. So are we moving in the right direction? We have used some very good initiative. Obviously, State Bank has done a lot during this COVID reason, but I can recall the statement of my Honorable Governor when he said that क्या एक बीमारी की वजह से मैं क्या interest rate कम करूं? And then subsequently you reduce it from 13.5% to 7%, and which paid off. So we need to soul search. Where is my politics? Where is my political economy? Where am I? Can I follow this principle of IMF program, or I have to get out of it? This is food for thought for all of us. In my humble view, we have to soul search. मैं अभी एक काम कर रहा हूँ SDPI के साथ. डॉक्टर साहब आप तो हमेशा मेरे साथ ही रहती है, हमजा भी रहेंगे, और सारे डॉक्टर्स को मैं कहता हूँ, we are working ICAP as a vice president ICAP and as chair of economy and economic advisory and government relations committee. We are initiating a very thoughtful session on charter of economy. We will be framing issues. Help us. And then we will take up this case to the political parties that come and reply this. Whenever you are in the government, you just forget this. Whenever you are in opposition, you just propagate it. So take a single stance and adopt a similar policy for Pakistan. Mark my word, with these policies, you can never recover your economy. We were in the middle of secondary economic stage. All of a sudden, we offered a budget of loot sales. We reduced everything, every duty, and especially on motor vehicles. We have imported vehicles, CBU, worth $3.61 billion. Now we are propagating borrow and spend. Can we afford this? I don't think. So instead of going into figures and details, we have to soul search the basic framework of economy. We can read from everywhere, every book is there. And by the way, economics is an art, not a science. Yes, we can project very fancily, but at the end of the day, I think we need to soul search from our own perspective. Tax reform is the key, economic reforms are the key, and obviously charter of economy is one of the main factors which we need to address. Agriculture tax, tax on traders, they all are the need of the hours. With these words, I'm extremely grateful to SDPI again for inviting me, and I'm sorry if I have hurt anyone. ये आप लोगों का ताबुन चाहिए मुझे, और ये हम करेंगे हमारे पाकिस्तान के लिए. देखिए मेरा पाकिस्तान में जो स्टेक है ना वो बहुत ज्यादा है, इसलिए कि मेरे बच्चे भी बाहर से पढ़ के पाकिस्तान आ गए, वहीं पे काम कर रहे हैं। तो प्लीज ये हमें पाकिस्तानियत के तौर पर सोचना है, नॉट एज अ प्रोफेशनल। हमारे इंटरेस्ट, ये सब बैठे हुए पैनलिस्ट को मैं देखता हूँ, उनका कोई पर्सनल इंटरेस्ट नहीं है जो यहाँ बैठे हुए, सारा पाकिस्तान इंटरेस्ट है हमारा। तो वी हैव टू स्टेप फॉरवर्ड। हमजा, कम बैक। Thank you very much, Pakistan Zindabad.
Ashfaq sir, thank you so very much. Very big
And please,
question.
please, I beg your leave because I have to attend a funeral there. Okay? Thank
Each
you.
question needs a full day discussion. जो आपने सवाल उठाए हैं, तो हम इंशाल्लाह जो आपके साथ कर रहे हैं आने वाले टाइम में will keep these questions there.
ये
Thank you so
आपकी
much.
ये क्वेश्चन है ना, ये आप अगर देना चाहें मुझे ईमेल पे दे दें, we can circulate it. We can reply and you can circulate so among the participants.
No, I mean you have very big questions, raised big questions, और उनमें से हर एक सवाल जो है उसको पूरे दिन की डिस्कशन चाहिए. We'll come back later, sir. Thank you so much. Or I'm sorry, we are already out of our time almost. Not almost, actually, really. So let me just request again our remaining panelists to be very generous with us, and if you can wind up in earliest possible that you can. It's my very humble request. So let me bring State Bank of Pakistan, because I'm told that they have some other meeting to go as well. Akhtar Ahmad Saab, Senior Joint Director, State Bank of Pakistan.
Assalamu alaikum ji.
Sir, if you can in 5 minutes, I'll be personally obliged.
Yes, thank you. Am I audible, Dr. Saab?
Yes, please, you are.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, esteemed panelists. Sorry, due to a technical glitch, my camera has stopped working at the very last minute. But anyway, I'll quickly skim through what I have to say at this conference. I want to begin by thanking SDPI for inviting State Bank in its Sustainable Development Conference on lessons learned from the pandemic. You know, pandemic was a wake-up call for everyone, including financial institutions. Yes, we have had, human lives were lost, and as Dr. Hamza rightly stated that economic output was lost as well. But at the same time, it gives us a very unique opportunity to build back better and to build back stronger. So it gives me an immense pleasure to be part of such a diversified group of panelists, for exchanging ideas and experiences on sustainable development. As rightly pointed out by Dr. Shamshad, sustainability as a goal has become mainstream in many sectors, including financial industry. Financing for promoting sustainable development has become the need of the hour. I believe to make transition to such a green economy, specific enabling environment or conditions are required, which actually makes these green sectors an attractive opportunity for investors and businesses. As we are all well aware that Pakistan's economy is currently facing numerous challenges, including adverse impact of climate change. It is an imminent threat to people, society, environment, as well as Pakistan's economy. To overcome this challenge, it's an immense challenge. State Bank of Pakistan has been proactively promoting green banking to encourage financial industry for adoption of green and sustainable banking practices. Under the umbrella of green banking, we have taken several initiatives, both on the developmental side and as well as on the regulatory side. On the developmental side, we issued a financing scheme for renewable energy in 2016 with a view to promote renewable energy projects in the country. This particular initiative is aligned with the SDG goal 7. As you all know, it's ensuring access to affordable and sustainable energy. Based on the positive feedback from relevant stakeholders, we revised the scheme in July 2019, and similarly, we also introduced an Islamic version of the same in order to cater to the faith-sensitive clients. See, the objective of this scheme is to promote clean energy projects and meet electricity demand through renewable energy sources, and at the same time, it is aligned with the government of Pakistan's goal to convert 60% of the energy needs into renewable energy. And I'm very delighted to share that we've seen great response from the market. Just to throw in some numbers, the renewable energy financing has skyrocketed since the last year. Just last year, in June 2020, the amount of spending was 15 billion. At the end of June 2021, we are at 53 billion. So we can see there has been a substantial increase in just 1 year. About 700 projects have been financed so far, and it has the potential of adding around 1,000 megawatts of energy supply through the renewable energy sources. So that was from the developmental side. What we've done on the regulatory side is that we have issued green banking guidelines in October 2017. Just to give you a quick glimpse of what it contains basically environmental risk management, green business facilitation, and banks' own impact reduction. Environmental risk management is a very integral part of these guidelines, as it encourages banks to integrate environmental risk into banks' credit risk management for increasing financial stability through management and mitigation of environmental exposures of financing portfolios. It is most important component of green banking, and it is designed to incorporate procedures for evaluation and management of environmental and climate change risks of current as well as future financing or investments of banks in credit risk management procedures. Currently, many banks have actually established their environmental risk management procedures and developed environmental due diligence checklists and risk ratings to better evaluate and manage environmental and climate change risks. To transition to a green economy, it is very important that the banks have to first actually identify through how much they are basically causing through their loans or through their investments, they are causing environmental or climate change risk. Green business facilitation, the second component of the green banking guidelines, it encourages banks to facilitate environmental friendly green businesses. This particular area has been designed to align the focus of the banking industry's investments with SDGs, including focus on clean water and sanitation, which is SDG Goal 6, affordable and clean energy, which is SDG Goal 7, and sustainable cities and communities, etc. I'm very happy to share again that several banks have established strategies for facilitation of green businesses by including a policy statement for allocation of funding resources to those businesses that directly or indirectly want to improve their carbon footprint. Banks are also working on their own in developing its green products. On impact reduction, it basically the green banking guidelines guide banks and the financial industry to reduce their impact on environment through conscious management of their consumption of energy and other resources, which again indicates compliance of SDG Goal 12, responsible consumption. The activities under this component may include, just to give you a few examples, it may include usage of paperless banking operations and services.
Akhtar sir, may I request you please wrap up? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll just wrap it up quickly. So some of the examples that I was talking includes usage of paperless banking operations and services, etc. Now to go further. Since these guidelines were issued in 2017 and it required an update, so we have recently initiated Pakistan Sustainable Banking Project in collaboration with IFC. The goal is to improve existing green banking guidelines and also to increase the share and volume of banks' loans under the green banking domain. The project is based on 3 phases. First is to develop implementation tools of the SBP green banking guidelines and to raise awareness and capacity of the entire banking industry and create market capacity for local training intermediaries. We are in the first phase currently, and we are very positive about the outcome of this project. That will be it from my side, Dr. Sajid.
Thank you, and we are so sorry pushing you a bit fast on the pace. Dr. Nadia, over to you. Dr. Nadia is consultant with ADB and has been covering a multi-range research and public policy issues on her work. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Sajid Saab. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you, UNESCAP and SDPI. Although I'm not feeling well today, but I have noted down a few points. A lot have already been said from the earlier panelists, so my focus would be narrow and precise based on the shared questions. Well, I had seen an Excel-based macro model shared by Hamza last year. I really appreciate the work done by the whole team. Well, the issues in our economy are very clear and solutions are also not hidden from anyone. The dilemma is that our politics take the front seat and our economy remains in the back seat. We have structural issues and weaknesses in the policy. For example, FBR says that whenever we try to change the evaluation table, then real estate tycoons come and warn about dharna and stuff like that. So we are facing huge issues with the current account balance, which is understood after every hike in growth. Why have we allowed a big relief in the imports of cars, as Ashfaq Sahab has already mentioned? Well, if we are importing too much, then on parallel, we should increase the exports, even though the government has revised the duty schedule, but it is too late now. The second point which I want to highlight here is that we are an oil inelastic economy and facing severe issues of IPPs. So our policies should be designed in the same way. Coal is now out of fashion. We started Bhasha Dam in the time of Musharraf. What has happened till now? None. I mean, nothing. We can't see anything happened materialistically. So if we still have to make electricity through oil, then wherever the economy goes up, we will face the same issues which we are facing now. The third point is inflation, which is nowadays an international phenomenon, but we have had this issue before this universal crisis. The problem is that when the oil prices get increased by 5%, then commodity prices get up by 7%. Why? Although that should not hike by more than 2%. Unfortunately, there is no mechanism to tackle this issue. If producers can collude, then why not government take action against them? The quality of our products is also not competitive. Unfortunately, the one who imports from us once, most of the time they do not import next. So this is government's job to do work on it. My last point would be that we had seen a rise of almost 12% in manufacturing sector last year, but that does not translate into our exports. Where did those items gone? Do we have a high demand domestically? If so, then why we always complain about the poor in the society? We have lost our credibility in front of IMF and other multilateral institutions, as we always mention about the poor population and their miseries. In fact, we do not work for them. So my suggestions would be that the solution is very fundamental. Number one, to increase exports. Number two, to increase savings. Without increasing both of these, we can never solve the issues. Whenever growth comes up, we don't have savings to capture, and ultimately we take more local or foreign loans. We can learn from the leading examples of Malaysia, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, how they have increased their exports. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Nadia, double thanks for very precise points and saving us a couple of minutes. And definitely the growth structure of Pakistan does not support saving. When I was asked that what is the biggest risk to Pakistan's economy, I think a higher growth rate is the biggest risk with this composition that we do have. And thank you highlighting it once again. I'll be coming later to Dr. Imtiaz Saab, but let me just invite to Dr. Shahid Naeem Saab for his chief international trade today's, but most relevant to today's discussion was his chief SDGs, when most of the SDGs localization work was being done in Pakistan. Dr. Shahid Naeem was heading that. He was chief SDGs. Sir, over to you. What has been government doing on this one, and what can be done based on your previous experience in SDGs? Over to you, sir. Shahid Saab, can you hear us, please? Shahid Saab, we cannot hear you. We cannot hear Shahid Saab. Can you check? Okay. I'm told that there is a voice in the technical guy. Can we hear us, all of you panelists? None of us is able to hear. No. Shahid, we cannot hear you, unfortunately. No, still. Can you unmute yourself, please? Maybe you are muted. But आवाज क्यों नहीं आ रही?
Hello.
Can hear now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I've already wasted a couple of minutes. Almost all of the points that I noted for discussion today have already been discussed in one way or the other, for or against. So I will only take up 2 or 3 issues and then hand it over back to you. Knowing that COVID had impacted everyone and the economy from various perspectives. Knowing that Bureau of Statistics informed us that only in the first year, 21 million workers were impacted due to the COVID. and knowing that bulk of them reported that they had to reduce their non-food expenditure to move forward. Knowing that 3/4 of the workforce in Pakistan is in informal sector, and we didn't have a registry of informal workers at the time when it was needed. Although the labor expert group earlier to that had already recommended to the government that we should have a live registry of informal workers, so that in cases like COVID, we could do some targeted interventions. I'm pleased to inform that now Ministry of Poverty has established a labor-related unit in that ministry, and that has prioritized this task as one of its first assignment. So soon you will see that informal workers will have a process as a portal, and in future governments will be able to direct measures for them. We also know that the new National Socio-Economic Registry is going to be a live registry instead of the previous experiences where we had static registries. Now, individuals would be able to register, come inside or get out of the registry all throughout the year based on a specific process. We've talked about the impact of the government's stimulus package of 1.2 trillion. If you look at the breakup of that, 200 billion for daily wage workers, 50 billion for utility stores, 70 billion rupees for relief in fuel prices, 15 billion support for health and food, 110 billion relief for electricity bills for businesses and for individuals, 100 billion emergency contingency fund. You see, all these were directed towards achieving or towards supporting SDGs 1, 2, 4, 5, 8, inequality 10. So the whole stimulus package was directed in line with the sustainable development. Then Dr. Shamshad referred to our fragile and insufficient health system. Had this 25 billion transferred to NDMA for purchase of necessary equipment not been there, it would have been a disaster, you know. So that investment in the health system has paid off to some extent. Similarly, State Bank's initiatives for deferring the payment of principal loan, increasing regulatory limit to on extension of credit to SMEs, and many others, they have helped in sustaining the businesses. The policy of smart lockdowns instead of full lockdowns in the cities, all these were has helped in sustaining to some extent the economy. Very rightly said that there is a huge financing gap. There is a huge financing gap, despite the fact that the priorities also need to be aligned with the SDGs. I hope you know that now every PC1 has one page annexure with it to assess how much that project would contribute to achieving SDGs. So in one way, the monitoring of development expenditure is going to start soon, and we'll be able to see how much of the development fund is going. Similarly, in case of health sector for supporting SDG 3, the Prime Minister's Health Insurance Initiative is going to work a lot in the future. And similarly, the one decision, the bulk of the dropouts in education system was at primary level. So this one decision to promote all primary schools into middle will at least give a boost to education system, and we hope that the now completion to grade 8 would be achieved hopefully. Another very important initiative was the creation of NCOC, which had been taking stock of COVID situation day by day and has been taking decisions. with regard to vaccination, the NCOC reports that almost 55 million people have been fully immunized, while more than 100 million people have got one shot of the vaccination. A total of 130 million vaccine doses have been administered so far. So these are some of the highlights of the actions that government has taken. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shahid Saab, for bringing us what government has been doing. And one of the most important point coming is that every PC1 will be having a SDGs alignment farm. But let's see how it comes out. And there was yesterday a point coming out from the presentation that it will be good to even share the PC1s online so that people can see that what is happening, what the government is planning, what are the gains. But thank you so very much. On the vaccination, definitely, it has been more than expected, but still there is a very huge vaccine hesitancy, particularly in the vulnerable groups and the marginalized. So thank you so very much for bringing us this. This brings us to further concluding remarks before I invite our very honorable session chair to let me go to Dr. Imtiaz Saab for his thoughts from the Ministry of Finance, which is actually on the center of this financing economic recovery. Over to you, sir. And we are so sorry that we have taken, we have made you wait longer than what we committed actually with you.
Sir, thank you very much. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Are you hearing me, sir?
Yes, sir, we can.
Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and very good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the SDPI for providing us an opportunity to listen the valuable discussion of Dr. Shahnaz Akhtar, Dr. Hamza Malik, Dr. Sajid Saab, and Ashfaq Tola Saab, and Dr. Nadia Farooq, and inviting me to say a few words on the panel toward post-COVID resilient economies, which is organized in collaboration with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. I think this is very useful discussion on evidence-based fiscal policies for sustainable recovery from COVID-19 and how the SDPI UNESCAP work can help in this regard. It is my profound privilege and pleasure to speak on this distinguished gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, fiscal policy, as we know, has an effective role in promoting sustainable and inclusive growth. A well-structured fiscal policy ensures the efficient allocation of public resources. It encourages effective public spending and creates fiscal space for priority investment, thus create a favorable environment for achieving higher economic growth. The role of fiscal policy is very important in delivering the sustainable development goals. It can mobilize domestic resources, encourage efficient use of public spending, stimulate private investment, and improve consumer behavior, thus help in achieving SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic had impacted the whole world, as it was health as well as economic crisis. In order to address the health-led economic crisis, countries around the world responded swiftly with a variety of policy measures, largely in the form of monetary and fiscal interventions for the economy and health-related measures for the pandemic. On the fiscal side, government helped household and business in the form of transfer, wage subsidies, and liquidity support. These measures were supplemented with other aspects of social safety nets. All these policy actions contributed significantly to lessen the economic impact of COVID-19 and protected the global economy from further deterioration. The pandemic has posed a significant challenge to achieve the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. Here I would like to mention the United Nations Economic and Social Survey of Asia and Pacific 2021 has found that slow regional progress in implementing the transformative 2030 agenda for sustainable development has increased vulnerability to shocks. The countries should prioritize stronger alignment of the COVID-19 recovery packages with the 2030 agenda. According to the survey 2021, whole policy options are numerous and diverse. Asia Pacific countries must focus on those that maximize their strength and are feasible given their institutional capacities. It is therefore urgent that every country utilize its limited fiscal resources in the most efficient way, relying on comprehensive analysis to assess the best course of action. Coming over to a few points on fiscal policy in Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, like the whole world, Pakistan's economy has affected by the COVID and its economic growth contracted by 0.47 in the year 2020. The government focused on reducing economic losses and maintaining the social and economic well-being of the affected and vulnerable segments of the society. On fiscal side, largest ever stimulus package was announced that covers the allocation of emergency response, support to business, and relief to citizens. This package was also complemented by liquidity support for the industry, especially SMEs from State Bank of Pakistan. The government's efficient and timely measure against the pandemic allowed economic activities to continue in the difficult time. As a result, in fiscal year 2021, economy has witnessed a V-shaped recovery. The trend of core economic indicators are encouraging, and the growth for the ongoing fiscal year seems on a higher path as compared to previous years. Ladies and gentlemen, Pakistan is following a fiscal consolidation strategy with a view to improve revenues and controlling non-productive expenditure. The fiscal strategy of Pakistan strikes a careful balance between supporting the economy and commitment to fiscal consolidation. In this regard, the fiscal policy measures are largely focused on relief measures to support business and to protect vulnerable segments of society. It also aims at enhancing development spending across various sectors like agriculture, industry, and social sector development. During the present recovery phase, in the post-COVID scenario, the fiscal policy is focused on investment in infrastructure, both physical and digital, with an emphasis on green initiatives, investment in human capital, including skills, and capacity enhancement of human resource. Ladies and gentlemen, to further strengthen the economic gain and to achieve higher and inclusive and sustainable economic growth, government has set its priority in the budget 2021-22 across different sectors such as agriculture package, industrial package, incentive for export promotion, ease of doing business reforms, investment promotion strategy, increase in public PSDP spending, and Prime Minister's package for construction, Kamyab Pakistan program. Moreover, initiatives on environmental side have also been launched, like Green and Clean Pakistan movement, electric vehicle policy, and green economic stimulus. Here, I would also like to mention that as a macroeconomic model developed by SDPI and UNESCAP to support the design of economic recovery package for countries in the Asia and Pacific region offers insight how countries can build resilience in the post-COVID-19 era, while enhancing sustainability along economic, social, and environmental dimensions. I also appreciate the SDPI's study based on this model with an aim to support the government in designing and implementing evidence-based fiscal policies to enable and sustain a fair and green recovery from COVID-19 in Pakistan. Their objective is to support and strengthen policies which are necessary to improve the socio-economic welfare of people. Suggestions of the study are very useful to uplift socio-economic condition of the common man at faster pace. At the end, I would like to thank everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Imtiaz, for bringing us perspective from Finance, Ministry of Finance. And thank you for appreciating our work. And we do hope to continue this collaboration and actually the practical use of that model in collaboration with you, Ministry of Finance and other ministries. I really thank you. Just let me now go back to our session chair. Ma'am, back to you for your concluding thoughts. I thank you, all of you, on behalf of SDPI and UNESCAP as well. Thank you. Ma'am, can you please unmute yourself? Yes, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and also, like it was just said a while back by Dr. Imtiaz Ahmad, I think SDPI is really shaping up as one of the instrumental think tanks, and with this very large gathering that you have been able to assemble, and the diversity of the subject matters that you have brought to the table. And as was pointed out, I mean, we have to really start thinking independent of the multilateral institution and the system. And I think it's very refreshing that all of us really were presenting perspectives on the economy from our own perspective and not necessarily the fund, IMF, or for that matter, the World Bank and ADB. I think some of these institutions have lost their way, and hence it's important we need to work together. I know Hamza always was critical, but I am joining his ranks lately, sitting in Pakistan and watching the performance of the multilaterals. But coming back to the subject matter, I think we have really benefited from very rich presentations of everyone. I have to compliment Hamza. He's true to his discipline, and as usual, very exhaustive presentation, and very instrumental insights into the Asia Pacific SDG scenario. I'm not going to go into the details of any presentation because of the time constraint, but I need to also compliment you, Sajid Amin Saab, because your paper I had already read since it was submitted earlier. And that was the only paper I read of this event. And I felt that it's important that we really generate this kind of work for the benefit of the country's policymakers. Whether they listen to us or not is a separate matter. I think they get a huge body of advice. But I would very much recommend that Dr. Sajid Saab, if you can really put together a couple of pages of the main messages of this particular session and share with us, at least the speakers, so that we could make sure that we could, if we have to add some more value to it, we could do that. But we do so for Pakistan context only, so that I just want to also say that although Nadia spoke the least, but she made the best contribution, as they say. You know, small is always beautiful, and it came through in the brevity that she used. So as I said, I'm not going to try to summarize the content of everybody's thing because that could take me longer. But the key message was that we are late in implementing the Sustainable Development Agenda, and we need to accelerate the pace of Sustainable Development Agenda. And the role, the significance of Sustainable Development Agenda in strengthening the resilience of the economy has been well acknowledged by every speaker, as I see. And it's important that we keep in mind some of the slides of the frequency of the crisis episodes and the cost of it that Asia Pacific has faced, but the world has faced. And I think we should really acknowledge that Pakistan not only faces, is at the frontier of facing some of these international shocks, but Pakistan generates its own unique shocks for itself. And what are the consequences of that? So Hamza and I will have a debate about it. And I hope Hamza can put his team to analyze that so that we can, in your next SDPI, contribute that paper to our Pakistani authorities of what causes. My last point, which I think is very important, that I think I'm more and more convinced sitting in Pakistan that we need to stop worrying about the public sector now. We should be thinking about what can be done in the private sector. I have to say that there is so much learning from the private sector. And we should focus more and more in trying to augment really the private sector because there is so much substance in the private sector of Pakistan, and somehow we need to unleash the potential of the private sector because I mean I have been working more on the private sector issues in what I do, because I'm not necessarily working with the government, but I'm working with private entities, which is by design, because I feel there is so much action that's happening. And I've stopped writing papers, by the way. I do more real work on the ground. So my suggestion to everybody is that these papers do not have any major value proposition in Pakistan, but we really need to roll our sleeves and work with the civil society to transform our economy. So I'm going to stop here. Sorry, my throat is bad, so I can't really talk more. And thank you, Sajid Saab. You have really contributed substantially, but I'm really indebted to Abid Suleri, who's a great contributor on every front. And I have managed to pick up so much from his working with the various civil society people and all that. And I think that makes a huge amount of difference. All the best to you all.
Ma'am, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Despite your bad throat, you have contributed the best of the that you can. I'm again thankful to all of you, and Hamza joined me in thanking you all on behalf of UNESCAP and SDPI. And I'll be preparing a summary note on this one, and we will be sharing it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, SDPI. Thank you, Dr. Akhtar.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia. Thank you, Dr. Imtiaz Saab. Thank you, Shahid Saab. And Akhtar Saab also. Thank you so very much.
Khuda Hafiz. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you, Allah Hafiz.